We're joined by Osman Trici in Calgary. This is Ryan Schroeder and Jeremy Wong. I'm Art Quo. Most people walk to their destination in a straight line, which seems sensible. Okay, it's delayed. And it makes sense because it's the shortest path, and at least for study walking, it's the most economical. But is it economical for walking a fixed distance from A to B? It's never been proven, theoretically, experimentally, that it is, and even though it might make sense. And in fact, today, we're going to disprove it. Let's start with study walking, with the classic result, which is that the preferred walking speed for study walking approximately coincides with the minimum energy per distance or cost of transport. The problem with this is that most walking bouts are not steady. Michael Orndorff observed daily walking bouts and found that half of the bouts were less than 16 steps. So what do we know about walking a fixed distance? Actually, very little. We know that changing speeds is metabolically costly because you have to accelerate or decelerate. We know that the speed of fixed distance bouts increases with distance. It does approach the steady walking preferred speed, but for distances that are short enough not to be steady, they're smaller. So that's what we know. There's very little other data because the vast majority of human walking studies are on steady walking at a constant speed, often at the preferred speed, often at different speeds, but limited to that. The way we're going to tackle this is with the simplest walking model, and I won't go too much into it except we have a point mass pelvis on top of an inverted pendulum stance leg, and the most energetically important event for this model is the step-to-step transition, where at the end of one step, the velocity of the center mass is heading forward and down, and then it has to be redirected, which is done here with a combination of push-off from the trailing leg, and along the trailing leg, and then a collision along the leading leg, which is dissipative. And then the result of that is you have the new velocity, which is pointing in the right direction for the next inverted pendulum phase. And then the same model also applies to going up or downhill. The only difference is you gain speed, say, from going downhill or lose it going uphill. And then you can also calculate the work associated with these impulses. I won't go into that except to say that work constitutes the only energy that matters for this model. This work, we claim, accounts for a majority of human energetics during at least our previous studies on steady walking. So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to start with study level walking, which, as I said, is the level of current knowledge. And then we're going to move towards the path.
Well, hang on. Before we do that, why shouldn't we be talking at least about how people walk on a level straight, like simple path, before we get to all sorts of different trajectories or the terrain varies and so forth?
Well,
Osman, are you talking?
Oh no. Can you say that again? You interrupted us.
I was saying the world isn't flat and straight walking is very boring. I guess we should first talk about uneven terrain walking.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're going to consider uneven terrain, maybe we should just consider the variance between people before we worry about just terrains.
Come on, what are you going to do if you're trying to chase after a target, but then the target is moving away from you? How are you going to do that?
Okay. So we'll do those things, and then we'll finally get to the most economical walking path. Okay, so let's start with fixed distance walking.
Okay, so over a single step, the energy cost is going to decrease for longer steps or for a longer time duration. And obviously our cost to time is going to increase for longer time durations. And the combination of these two costs is shown in this green curve with the optimal trade-off shown in this black dot here. Now, our cost of time, the orange line, is scaled by a slope, CT, which we refer to as the time valuation coefficient. And it is defined as the energy cost that the model would be willing to spend to save a unit of time. And so it's in units of power. Okay, as for greater values of the time valuation coefficient, we shift the optimal trade-off between energy and time to shorter time durations. And the energy, both of these curves, both the blue energy curve and the orange time curve, are convex in the push-off impulse and in the time duration. So that makes the optimization relatively simple, helps out. And so the question is, how do we generalize this to multi-steps? Well, the time and energy of multiple steps is just the sum of the energy and time for individual steps. And so the convexity holds for these generalized walking bouts of multiple steps. Now, before we jump into the optimal control and the human data, let's first just consider minimizing this objective, energy and time.
How do I make this disappear?
The show video panel. Up.
Yes, show
Yeah.
video panel. How do I get the top bar to disappear?
High floating meter control.
Hide
Floating meter.
Oh.
Okay, cool. So let's just consider minimizing just the objective, which is going to give us simple power law predictions of how speed and duration vary for different bouts. Okay, so we have to. What is it?
Go through the presentation.
Oh, I have to- Thanks, I was ready for teaching. Okay, so this is our objective, energy, which is composed of three terms, two associated with the energy cost, our cost for push-off and our cost for initiation, and the third term is our cost of time. And if we just take the derivative of this with respect to our time duration t, and isolate for speed and for duration, we get some power laws, and they're going to predict how the model and people should vary their speed and duration as a function of distance. And it might look a little bit complicated and hard to parse, but just imagine that as distance goes large, we can note that if these stay constant, that the values inside this cube root are going to go to a constant. So we expect the optimal speed as distance increases to asymptote towards some optimal speed. And so overall, these two power laws give us predictions for the shape of the curves of peak speed over distance and duration over distance. And these power laws really well fit data collected by Art and Elizabeth Carlisle and published in eLife earlier this year. But of course, for trajectories, so for the speeds as a function of time as subjects walk, we need optimal control predictions that are going to make predictions for a fixed distance d of walking composed of n steps, starting and ending at rest, so zero velocity. And in our optimal control model, the decision variables are the push-offs, the gate initiation, which compose our work cost, and we can also throw in our time valuation coefficient as a decision variable as well. Here's an animation showing our optimal control results, optimized for about of 10 steps. Also plotted are the speed and work for each of the steps. And when you optimize also for a time valuation coefficient, you can really well predict, again, the peak speed and duration that subjects walked over these fixed distance bouts. Now we also have the trajectories over time. So these are showing the body speeds as a function of time, where each color represents bouts of a different distance. And these inverted U-shaped velocity trajectories look very similar to the velocity trajectories that were recorded by Elizabeth and Art. Now, we can also do individualized optimal control predictions. So we can optimize the time valuation coefficient CT for each subject, and we can find the optimal CT that fits each subject. And when we do so, we reduce the prediction error by half. The predictions were already really good, of course, but we can do even better. And the way I'm doing this is by normalizing the peak speeds and durations of the optimal control model, personalized for each individual subject, which shows a decrease in the spread of the data. Okay, so now that I've talked about fixed distance straight line walking and discussed the idea of an individual time valuation, I'll hand it over to Ryan to talk about pursuit of moving target.
So in locomotor pursuit, the basic idea is that you have some chaser and some target, and that target has some starting distance and it's moving with some velocity. And basically as a chaser, your only goal is to catch up to the moving target and get close enough and tag it and come to a stop. So we can imagine that the target velocity is moving with a constant speed in time, which means it's progressing its position forward linearly in time. And then the question is, how should the chaser catch up to the target? You could theoretically imagine any number of speed trajectories you could use to accomplish that. So this is where our optimal control problem comes back into play. Very similar to the last study, except now the ending condition is such that the chaser's position is either matching or exceeding that of the target. And now, whereas before distance traveled was an independent variable, in this particular task, distance traveled is just a new decision variable in the optimization. So we have our push-up inclusion again that help determine some optimal trajectory in time. And there's some average speed, time duration, and distance traveled associated with that trajectory. So if we plot step speed against time, we can make a number of predictions. For example, how you should optimally pursue a still target, so a target that's just sitting there, or a target that's approaching you, or one that's receding away from you. And we do this for, in this example, 7 total target speeds. And we compare all those trajectories to our human data. And one of the things we find is that the average speed of the chaser increases non-linearly as the target moves faster and faster away from you. And something similar happens in our human data. We also find that time duration and distance traveled also increase as the target moves faster away from you. And we can quantify the comparisons between our model and our human data. And so when we run a Pearson correlation, we find very strong positive correlations in all these different metrics. But we can take it a step further. So for example, if I ask an individual subject, just walk some fixed distance, say 5 meters in this case, what is the time duration it takes for that person to do that? For this example, we have 5.1 seconds is how long it took them. That corresponds to that individual's time valuation. And we use that valuation parameter in the model to make a whole host of predictions, including all their speed trajectories, the chaser's average speed, time duration, and distance traveled for all 7 target speeds and for 4 target start distances. And so we can basically compare all 28 of those conditions and all the predictions made from those 28 conditions to each of their corresponding human data. And again, we still get very strong correlations. So even though we're using just one simple measurement of that individual walking, we can independently predict 503 data points for that individual. But of course, we can also do that for all the rest of our subjects, and we get very similar results. Now, some of the things we find are some optimal features of pursuit. So for example, this nonlinear change in the chaser's average speed as they're chasing after a target that's moving more and more quickly away from them. We also find that shorter pursuits tend to be a lot less steady than longer pursuits. We find this sort of letting off the gas effect just before tag. So basically, both the model and humans sort of reduce their speed as they're approaching the target, getting ready to tag them. And we also find that subjects largely tend to walk toward an approaching target, even though they could just stand there and let the target move toward them. So they move toward the target with some non-zero speed and non-zero distance. And at least in the model, this is solely due to the time cost. So with that, I'll hand it off to my colleague on Zoom, Osman. So he's going to be talking about walking on uneven terrain.
We would like to predict walking speed on uneven terrain, and we develop an experiment for it and run our simple optimization model. In the experiment, test subjects began on level terrain. And then with the steady speed, then they walk over uneven terrain, and we expect they will optimize and compensate for the uneven terrain. Then they got back to level terrain to their steady speed. Unlike our other experiments, we instructed the test subjects to keep the walking duration constant as if they are walking over the same distance when it's level. You will see an experiment video on the right. And we've been talking about minimizing energy and time. Given our experimental time is constrained, this time we will only minimize for energy, and the CT, time evaluation coefficient, will enter the optimization as a Lagrange multiplier because we will run constraint optimization and with the associated and then beginning targets. One important point here is the horizon length, which refers to how far a person sees the uneven terrain to compensate. We can talk about an uneven terrain, complex uneven terrain, like many ups and downs, like this one, and you would have seen many different speed trajectories on it. But we first focused on a very simple uneven terrain, just a simple step up. Running our simple model, our model showed us a speed trajectory, an optimal speed trajectory over the step up. And maybe the most crucial aspect is the compensations of speed began in advance on level terrain even before stepping up, and model sped up first, then slowed down and sped up, having a triphasic trajectory. And testing humans and measuring their gate speed over the same terrain, you are seeing the average gate speed here with some standard deviation. We have the same anticipatory compensation that humans sped up in advance before stepping up. And we see the same triphasic pattern. So, we showed the speed fluctuations on uneven terrain for this terrain are systematic. The fluctuations overlap well with each other. There is an anticipatory component and showing the horizon matters. And minimizing mechanical work predicts well over the overall trajectory. Do these ideas apply to different terrains? Let's test some different terrains. You will see 7 different terrains here, and we already talked about stepping up. You are seeing the blue curve on the top is the model's optimal walking speed. The red one is measured gait speed of humans, and in between you are seeing the correlation coefficient. Quickly looking at the step down terrain, we see again the triphasic pattern, but this time the anticipatory component of speed is slowing down. And looking at the human data, right below, we see humans slow down as well before stepping down. Now we will look at all of the terrains at once, control, pyramid, and other terrains. Looking at the pyramid terrain, which is 3 steps up, 3 steps level S. 3 steps down, we see that our model has an anticipatory component of speeding up. And comparing with the human data, humans sped up as well before stepping over the pyramid terrain. We have good correlation. Looking at the down and up down terrain, we see that the anticipatory component here is slowing down and up down, the one right beside. And also we see that humans slow down as well, and we have good correlation between the model and human. Looking at the complex terrains, which each terrain has 17 steps, 17 uneven height changes, and of course on the complex terrain we have more speed fluctuations. But looking at human data, even for a complex terrain, the fluctuations fairly overlap well with each other. They are not random. And although our model is very simple, even for such a complex test, we have fairly good positive correlation between human and model. So we show that on uneven terrain, the speed fluctuations are not random. The subjects are self-similar, fluctuations are systematic. There is always an anticipatory component, which differs based on terrain variations. And finally, looking at the average correlation coefficient between humans and models across all terrains, and plotting it with respect to distance or horizon length, we found that 6 to 8 steps look ahead for humans are enough to optimally compensate for the uneven terrain. So we will use our findings on uneven terrain to explain the most economical path now.
The most economical path is reminiscent of a really classic optimal control problem called the brachistochrone, and that's the minimum time path for a bead to slide on a frictionless wire. Now our problem is similar to it, but it's actually harder. And the reason is because we are actually optimizing two things. We have to optimize the trajectory, basically the push-offs or the speed, the controls that the person has to produce, and we have to optimize the terrain profile. So it's two curves simultaneously, of which in both cases there are many possibilities for terrains and the speeds. Here as well, to make this a fair comparison, we need to have the flat terrain compared to the uneven terrain at the same overall average speed, and we do that by constraining the time in our optimization. Both of these are optimized for the same time, and therefore time again is fixed, and CT, the causal time, becomes a Lagrange multiplier. Okay, in our lab, this project took on the nickname Brachistocquo, and so we're going to use that for referring to the proposed optimized terrain. Okay, here are the results from the optimal control. Flat terrain turns out the optimization it should just be constant step height this is for 6 steps. And the Brachistocquo shows a decrease in height with the first half of the terrain, and then an increase for the second half. This is actually not to scale, so this is a spatially to scale plot of that curve. It's a very, very gentle depression, and then a gentle rise back to level. And then the rest is just the push-off and speed trajectories that go along with those. This is what the experiment looks like. This is the flat terrain, and that's the Brachistocquo. You probably can barely tell that it goes up and down. And to make sure the material and the distance are all the same, this is just the same structure, just flipped over in the two cases. So if you're wondering about compliance or things like that, we don't think that was a major difference. Another prediction from the model is that there's a speed-dependent effect. The whole effect here comes from having momentum, so more momentum is important, and so the Brachistocquo only does better in average power than the flat terrain at relatively fast speeds. And in fact, at some speed, they cross over, and then the Brachistocquo is worse than flat terrain. That's the prediction. Okay, so let's look at the data. Here's the human VO2 data for walking over and over again on the two terrains. And on the fastest terrain, the Brachistocquo was 8% cheaper in terms of net metabolic power. And then we also saw a trend towards the two of them converging at slower speeds. So we think faster is indeed better, and we also believe that straight line is not the most economical walking path. Okay, so let's rethink what we started with. We started with current knowledge and steady level walking. Well, here, the current knowledge is that the minimum cost of transport for long distances gives you the speed, the preferred speed. But if you use the first principles energy time model to walk fixed distance bouts, this is just continuous with finite distance bouts in a curve that we saw agrees well with humans. So we say fixed steady level walking is just a special case of fixed distance walking. In addition, we looked at different individuals, each of them who have a different preferred walking speed, but those are predictive of them walking bouts of different distances. So it's not just an empirical variable, it's something that you can identify and then use to predict other walks by the same individual. So fixed distance walking is just a special case of individualized time valuation. You can add another axis to this plot for target speed, where 0 target speed is just walking a fixed distance, and then now you've added pursuit. And we consider all of these previous cases to just be a special case of pursuing a moving target. It's just a matter of what the target speed is. This is what the surface actually looks like in the optimization, where now you see peak speed, distance, and target speed sort of extrapolated out. You can add yet another axis, which isn't so easy to illustrate on a 2D figure, but we examined many possible terrain variations, and we consider all of these cases of walking on level, flat terrain to be a special case of uneven terrain. And then uneven terrain includes the most economical walking path. So just to recap the different contributions from Elizabeth, Jeremy, Ryan, Osman, and Sam Pollock, and to acknowledge some funding sources. Thanks. Johannes was generous in giving us lots of discussion time, so we're hoping that people will have plenty of questions.
Just a short question. How did you define the energy in the optimization problem? So how did you formulate it and controls basically? I assume?
So energy is basically the positive work done by the model, which is mostly push-off work for each step. Plus there's work done to initiate gait from rest because the model's just standing and we give it a little push and there's work associated with that push. So those are the decision variables, and the work of those things is that's the energy. We call it energy instead of work because for the human, that energy, metabolic energy, is what we're measuring, and we're hypothesizing that the work of these things is a big contribution to the metabolic energy of the human. David, and then Andy.
So where do you think does the time variation come from? Is that somehow related to your base metabolic rate?
I think that's, so the question was, where does the time valuation come from? Is it related to basal metabolic rate? And I think that's an interesting question. We talked about that a little in the lab. In particular, we think that for long bouts, it may approximate something like the basal metabolic rate, because when you're doing just trying to walk in really long, that's maybe what your time valuation is. In the ARTS study in eLife, it looked like the time valuations ranged a lot for different people. So they ranged almost more than double in factors. So some people care a lot more about time, more than, I think, like double basal metabolic rate, roughly. And then I'm particularly interested because I would like to have a parsimonious objective to optimize reaching and walking and just do everything together. If I'm walking over and doing this, am I using a different time valuation for my arm versus my leg or something? It feels like you should be able to do just one thing. So I care about it a lot.
And just to add, if you insisted that CT is basal metabolic rate, then the total energy plus time is basically gross metabolic cost, and that would predict basically minimum cost of transport for steady walking. However, in our experiments, and I would say anybody who's really done experiments in real life, you don't actually see people walking at that speed. I think in just about any experiment, people, with young adults at least, people are walking faster than the so-called minimum cost of transport reference. And it could be a little bit because in experimental conditions, everyone's a little bit gung-ho. But we think that there is a component of the cost of time, which is a physiological cost, close to basal metabolic rate, plus a subjective, or you could say psychological cost, which is how much of a hurry am I in? How much do I have to get to the bathroom? Just all sorts of decisions that factor into how we move. There should be some connection between our psychology and then our actions, and those actions need not be treated as just, oh, well, we have no idea what's going to happen. That's just not objective. It's objective in some way.
Just kind of a comment on this, like if I'm going for a run or I'm told I have to go for a run, I don't know how long it's going to be, or if I, like at the end of a race or something, and I see the finish line, even if it's half a kilometer away, just automatically, I just psychologically, I just speed up a lot. Do you have any comments on that? Like your time evaluation really changes also based on the knowledge of how far, like how close to the end you are.
Well,
like.
this whole subjective component of, or psychological component of the